Chapter 1. Dangerous Dwarven Deeds, Awakening Memory Unknown, Idyllic Outsider's Rest. Drayden Alebelly, son of Daemar Alebelly, stood under Gelster and Aluster as they eased their way across the starlit night sky, following Aragster and Eternus, the third and primary moons of Torlenth. Taking his eyes from the astronomical bodies above, the dwarf centered himself as he stood with his pack against the just-locked main doors that led to the underground fortress known as Starstone City. The massive city sat at the center of Starstone Canyon, under 5 miles of rock and stone. The doors at which Drayden stood had been sealed since the beginning of the war to act as a primary defense against the Hob armies that had been opened only twice since. The stone elf chosen by the council had left through these very doors to seek help at the Sylvan Enclave, and Drayden's present situation forced him to use the doors to facilitate his excursion to find both help for the dwarves as well as the now missing stone elf. Drayden knew the safer route lay inside the expansive city itself, the interior tunnels that wrapped around to the west before finally heading vaguely south had been known to take just under a moon cycle for even fastest elf with no burden. The council had used their own style of persuasion on him, however, to make sure he understood that he could not spare the least bit of time in the matter of finding assistance for the canyon. Drayden didn't find it surprising that immediately after leaving through the main doors, the dwarves inside operating the locks had sealed him out with the rest of his kin-eater forces. He knew that the safety of the city and the clan's underground took precedence over his own personal well-being. The young warrior stayed close to the shadows caused by the rough outcroppings of rock along the canyon walls, hoping the dark cloak he wore didn't slip open at the wrong time to expose any part of him. Creeping silently along the wall of the canyon to his right-hand side, he gazed out at the cold fire pits and empty houses where the stone elves had lived before the council had ordered them all to the safety of Starstone City. He shook his head at the amount of fear that the hobgoblins and other beasties had put in even the bravest of his people. It galled him to no end to think that those black-blooded Yaun might even win if he couldn't find the necessary help. Shifting his battered backpack beneath his dark cloak, he froze as he heard the grunts of ogres far above him at the lip of the canyon wall. Due to the nearly still night with very little breeze, he understood how well sound carried. Not daring to even breathe, Drayden felt a slight whiff of air flutter past his eyes, the only part of his cloak allowing for exposure. Drayden sent a silent prayer to Timoris Onu, the only god in the pantheon that he dealt with by name, to keep the wind from giving away his presence to the ogres above. The young dwarf again thanked the Warguard scouts for giving him the cloak that almost doubled as a slice of night to wrap around himself, yet the lack of movement in his limbs sent tremors through his bones. His muscles wanted to move, fast and deadly. He forced down his primal instinct to try and find the quickest route to the ogres. The deciding factor to stay his body lay deep below his feet. He wanted to be sure that the denizens of Starstone City kept their routine lives. After untold candle marks, he heard a second scuffling of feet from above. He listened carefully, straining his round ears for any sound whatsoever. Hearing what he had hoped to be blank air above him, he eased himself forward, the least favorite part of the leg of his journey ahead. A narrow path just over a foot wide rose up 300 feet over the canyon floor and around the large gardens of the stone elves. To take the chance of crossing the gardens directly, Drayden knew he would have to leave the safety of the canyon wall. Faced with the choice of either exposing himself outright to any sentries above or taking the higher, more narrow path where one misplaced foot could easily throw him back down to the rocky floor of the canyon, Drayden made a final check of his pack and weapons. Taking a deep and calming breath, he shifted his course further to the right, away from the garden, sitting unharvested under the pale moonlight. Barely safe in the best of light, the small footpath turned into a deadly weapon to the unwary. The stone lip of rock posed its own set of problems. Drayden again prayed to Timoris Onu to keep his feet safely on the path. The sentry ogres plodded over their already beaten path as the night deepened. All 4 moons had sunk over the horizon by the time they had reached the spot where they stopped once before to relieve the previous sentries. The larger of the 2 ogres stopped short and sniffed the air. "Wrong?" the smaller of the 2 asked in a burbling grunt of their native ogre tongue. The larger dwarf nodded. Go on, sniff, dwarf. Dwarf? The smaller one rubbed his belly wistfully. Early into the war, he had been able to dine on those dwarves and elves he had taken in battle. Now, after the delicious squishies had sealed themselves in their hole, he had lost what fine dining he could gather. Hungry! Quiet! Here! The large ogre stepped from the path that many bestial feet had etched into the rock and eased forward to the side of the canyon. Trying to keep his footing while looking down, he scuffed a few stones over the edge of the side of the canyon wall. His eyes, sharp in the dim light, couldn't quite make out anything in the mere starshine from the sky above. What? The large ogre shook his head and looked at his companion. Nothing. Hungry. Belly tricks. The smaller ogre nodded. Same. Hungry belly tricks. Drayden clutched the side of the canyon wall as he heard the return of the grunting from above. He pressed himself to the stone. He tried to will himself to become part of the rock face. A faint clattering from above grew louder. Drayden held back a wavering groan when small stones and rocks cascaded down from what had to be the lip of the canyon. He knew immediately that the beasties had discovered him. Yet he waited. He heard no alarm from the creatures. The young dwarf forced himself to return from the brink of panic that had built inside of him. Listening again for the sound of burbling grunts of the ogres, he held his position until he knew he could move again without his hands and feet quaking. Drayden knew he didn't have all night to stay on the wall. He had a panoramic view of the land beyond Starstone. He realized that once the sun rose up over the horizon to fill the day with its golden light, the beasties would see him clearly and raise the alarm. Gazing out onto the vast distance just beyond the boundaries of the canyon proper, he saw numerous pinpricks of light. The fires easily marked the pit-spawn army's newly taken territories. Taking a deep breath, Drayden eased himself forward, cautious to listen for the telltale sounds of the ogres above him. Scraping along the ledge, he tried to readjust his pack again. He wanted to take a newer pack, yet due to his haste involved with the order from the council, he had to make his older, more broken-in backpack. Shifting it on his back, he felt something rip near his right armpit. Reaching around slowly, he eased the backpack off his right shoulder and carefully brought it forward to cradle in his left arm. Trying to work his way along the edge with one arm encumbered, he'd wondered when he'd end up treading into thin air before taking the final fatal fall onto the canyon floor. Easing forward, he felt a dribble of sweat steal out of his brown hair and roll onto his forehead. Ignoring the bead of perspiration, he inched his way along. Then a fierce sting came into his eye as the sweat bypassed the bushy eyebrow and almost aimed itself for his left eye. He bit back a string of curses as he clenched his left eye shut. Just as he thought he would again have to stop and deal with the stinging in his eye, he felt the ledge slope gently downward. A grin flitted over his bearded face once he realized only a few hundred spans separated him from the luxury of rubbing his affected orb. Upon placing his feet on the canyon floor again, it took all of his control to keep from bolting to the doors that would take him back into the tunnels. Staying against the canyon wall for cover, he knuckled the sweat out of his left eye. He hefted his pack in his left arm before heading out. Drayden kept his pace slow and deliberate until finally reaching the doors and giving a coded knock. The moment seemed to stretch into candle marks as it passed like seasons. "It's about time," Drayden grumbled, sliding through the narrowly open door. He stood in the darkness of the chamber as he watched the lifelight, the energy given off by living beings, of the two door guards move about the closing door. Once sealed, a flare of fire bashed back the darkness momentarily as one of the door guard ignited a torch. Drayden blinked the flashes of light out of his vision. "Bring that torch over this way," Drayden said once he had control of his sight. He hoisted up his backpack and inspected it. The rip he had felt caused a separation of strap and seam in 2 places. The young dwarf shook his head, wiping a hand down his brown beard that barely reached his belly. "Do you want a new pack?" one of the door guard, a stone elf, gray-skinned and armored in war guard regalia, asked as he inspected the rip. "I have one if you need it." Drayden nodded at the stone elf. "Yeah, I need it." The other door guard, a dwarf in the same type of leather and metal armor, chuckled. "Here, whelp, take mine. The wife made it for me last moon. Ain't been nothing in it but meals for me lately. I'll take your old one in trade." The older dwarf held out his pack to Drayden, who came up to the dwarf's nose. Drayden agreed and gave over his pack in exchange for the newer one offered him. After shifting contents from pack to pack, Drayden looked up at the dwarf from his resting place on the floor. "Thanks. I was going to get me a new one, but the council said I had to get a move on quick like." "Don't mention it. If you get back with your help, I'll trade you back if you want." Drayden thought about it for a moment. "Let me get a set of knuckles off you, and then we'll talk." The older dwarf nodded and hauled out his ale skin and tankard from his newly acquired pack and gripped it at the bottom in his calloused fist. Pouring the ale into the copper mug, he stopped when the liquid reached the level of the top of his highest finger on the tankard. "Here you go, whelp." Drayden gratefully accepted the measure of ale and drank it down greedily. "Deal," he said as he handed the tankard back. "Good. I best see you still breathing after all this war's over and done with." "The same can be said for myself as well," the stone elf door guard stated. Drayden nodded. "I gotta get going on my way. Hope to see you on the front line soon." After clasping arms with both the dwarf and the stone elf, Drayden moved along to the other passageway that would take him closer to leaving the canyon. The sound of the enlarged community filtered up through the tunnels to Drayden's ears as he stood at the doors of the southern access of Starstone City. The door guards, armored in nearly the same fashion as the ones he'd already encountered, patiently waited while the 4-foot 2-inch dwarf meditated. Drayden listened to the two cultures eating out of the same bowl, as his mother had a fondness of saying. She would most often have it reserved for the times of dire need when the dwarves and snow elves had to gather together in the underground city below the canyon. "You about ready, boy?" one of the two dwarves asked Drayden as he stood there. The young dwarf gave the door guard a nod and while adjusting his cloak over his new pack. He looked around his home, breathing in the wonderful sense of hewn stone, forged metal, and sighed as the chamber fell into darkness. Drayden watched as the shimmering forms of the dwarves unsealed the door. He couldn't tell the figures apart as one of them approached him. "Find our missing elfkin," the dwarf said as he took Drayden's arm in a firm clasp. He didn't wait for the younger dwarf to respond before letting go and opening the door. Drayden passed through the door and into the narrow tunnel beyond. He'd never traversed this particular tunnel before. In fact, none but the members of the War Guard elite had ever passed through these half-natural vents to the surface. Drayden felt a tingle of pride and awe as his footfalls now ranked high enough to mingle with the footfalls of those who had gone before him. Thankful that the council had allowed him to use these particular tunnels, he had learned the secret of not getting lost inside them. The dwarves had added onto the existing vents a series of side passages meant to confuse and disorient any intruders into becoming too lost for their own good. The secret, he had learned, was to remain in a narrower path that led to the outside world, far away from the canyon's territories. The wood elf woke with a start. His green eyes flickered open at the motion of the stranger's body next to him in the unfamiliar bed. He scanned the unadorned room in the dim light as much as his eyes could move, suddenly aware and embarrassed at the touch of the sheet covering his naked body. Unable to see much from his vantage point, he tried to move his head and felt a series of sharp pains in his neck. Confused, the wood elf dragged a hand up from his side and gazed in shock at his arm's bandaged condition. Placing the bandaged hand against the side of his skull, the wood elf felt another set of bandages encompassing the majority of his head. He turned his bandaged head and again felt pain lace through his skull and neck. He didn't recall having done anything to warrant such excruciating agony. With his head finally turned to view the sleeping form next to him, he let out an audible groan. Next to him lay a gray-skinned elf shrouded in lifelight, the visible aura of all living things that elves could see from very dim light to perfect darkness. "Muerte Anselo," he rasped, his throat dry from lack of fluid and too much sleep. Just saying the stone elf's name conjured up the bad memories from the 4 moons of knowing him. Frowning to himself, he thought back to before he'd first met up with Muerte. Try as he might, though, he had no flicker, not even a hint of sensation of a previous memory. He let out a sigh of revulsion. Closing his green eyes, the wood elf meditated on everything of which he had a full grasp. I am Sapporo Ashbow, a druidic wood elf, follower of Tirahitha Megarilla. I have studied my craft under the tutelage of Master, or was it Mistress? Sapporo snapped his eyes open, causing another wave of pain to blast around the circumference of his skull. Blast it all, he grunted. Aside from the rituals and prayers he seemed to know by heart, he had no idea, no picture, not even a shadow of the face of his teacher, let alone any recognition of family or childhood friends. At first he found the revelation an after effect of whatever trauma he had experienced, yet once the initial grogginess had passed from his brain, he attempted the exercise again. Once more nothing came to the surface of the otherwise placid mind. Who in the blasted rings of all the blazes of 12 planes of all the hells forgets his own life? He asked himself severely. What's happened to me? Sapporo tried again to gaze across the room. Seeing no other signs of life, he tried to stare at the source of light in the room, a lantern set burning at a low wick on a table across the room, barely giving off a hint of a glow. Unable to properly focus on a lamp, he wondered if his pains had come from being captured with the stone elf. On second thought, he mused, did the blank slate of a mind come with capture as well? He recalled hiding out in a cave near the village of Abdias during a violent storm. The stone elf had walked up after the gale had passed. When Muerte explained that he'd been sent to look for the Sylvan Enclave to help against the bestials at Starstone Canyon, Sapporo had reluctantly agreed to join the cause. Yet the wood elf could still remember nothing prior to that meeting. Not that I would have been loath to give up all recognition of that blasted stone elf. He looked over to Muerte again. Blast you, he croaked at the sleeping form. Sapporo struggled to sit up in the bed. Every fiber of his being fought against any kind of capture, be it by his own actions or another's hand. He attempted to gain his feet. Standing at his full height of 5 limb and 7 leaf, he reached out to balance himself against the simple log headboard of the bed. He studied his own tan hand as he watched it miss its mark. Failing to regain his balance, he managed to catch the wooden floor with open arms. Bright light seared the backs of his eyes as his skull bounced off the floor. The druid flailed his arms about ineffectually as he commanded them to lift his body from the floor, causing even greater pain to shoot through his entire form. Trying not to give voice to any of the agony coursing through him, he heard the door to the small room open. Sapporo had a decent enough field of vision to see a set of feet step into the room. He craned his neck and felt something crackle between his skull and shoulders. Groaning as if near death, he still attempted to view his captor clearly. Rolling his eyes to the side, he felt recognition blast through his brain, almost pushing the agony he felt. He instantly recalled seeing the pale-skinned female before. His mind fell back to the strange attack he and Muerte had suffered. The flashes of color that had battered them both throughout the vines like a tornado seemed endless in their coming. Though through it all came an unending sensation of blades slicing deep into his flesh. Near the end, however, he'd succumbed to swirling arms of some kind, strangling him as he fought back. Then her face after being unconscious for untold time. The female elf had gazed down at him. Her pale blue eyes shot through with silvery glints. Forcing his unruly limbs to react, he tried to ward her off as she lifted him once again, only to find his extremities refusing his commands to move from the floor. Sapporo cringed inwardly as she eased his battered body over onto his back and lifted his head onto her crimson-robed lap. The druid tried to verbalize his desires of her leaving him alone. Instead of well-formed and articulated words, thin guttural sounds wavered from his lips. The elven woman stroked his brow and murmured words in some oddly accented dialect of Elven. He found the language strange to his ears. Sapporo didn't too much care for her touching him and again tried to make the appropriate noises to make his intentions known. The elf woman simply shook her head and smiled, continuing to speak. Sapporo couldn't identify much of what she said save for 3 words he had heard her say: battle, injuries, and prisoner. He fought with what remaining strength he did have against his apparent captor, but found himself in a losing match of wills. He felt himself lifted from the wooden floor and carried back to the bed as waves of sleep washed over him. Sapporo raged against the fall of his eyelids, but finally yielded to the sleep that dragged him down into a blackness from which he could not escape. Cryocentauri kicked the dirt he'd piled up next to his small cooking fire onto the coals. Waiting a few moments, he ground his boot heel into the dirt to fully extinguish any hopes of a stray ember rekindling itself into a deadly fire. He'd already packed his meager gear prior to his morning meal. Looking at the dense forest around him, he made sure that his 4 swords, the 2 dwarven short swords and 2 jewel-hilted long swords, rode properly in their back scabbards. He picked up his pack and glanced toward the even deeper part of the forest he'd been using as a travel marker. The silver-haired elf grinned to himself and wondered just how much further he would have to travel before reaching some sort of civilization. Breathing a light sigh, he rejoined his treks that had begun for him over 5 years before. "Stop right where you stand, Interloper," he heard in proper common Elven. "Why be you here?" Cryos grinned at the sound of a voice behind him. "I am merely a traveler who seeks the help of the elven kind," he replied in his native High Elven tongue. "You have entered the territories of the High Lady Silver Oak, Queen of the Sylvans." The Sylvan elf stepped around to face Cryos as he spoke the High Elven tongue fluently. "Lift your hands away from your weapons and allow my scouts to remove them from you," the tan-skinned elf said with a simple gesture. Cryos frowned. "I would rather you asked that of me in a way that would not be an insult to either of us." The Sylvan shook his head, his shoulder-length green hair waving slightly. "I see no insult in the removal of your weapons when entering our home. If you see an insult in that, then my elven kind will be more than willing to end your existence where you stand." Cryos looked deep into the eyes of the pine green of his impromptu host and arched an eyebrow. "Your guards? You guard your home well, Kautin," he said, using the High Elven term for the relative not of direct blood. "I will relinquish my weapons to you as you request." The High Elf reached up to the center of his chest and levered the release to his harness and shrugged off his 4 swords in one motion. Sliding the harness down his left arm, he gently handed the rig over to the Sylvan Elf in front of him. "Treat them well, Kutin. They have taken me farther than I have expected." The Sylvan looked into the High Elf's blue-gray eyes as he took the harness. "I will treat them as though they belonged to the High Lady herself." Cryos nodded and placed his pack on his shoulder as another Sylvan stepped up to him and wrapped a gray cloth around his eyes. The wandering elf felt a strange sensation as the strip of cloth touched his weather-beaten face. He couldn't identify the feeling right off, but once the Sylvan bound the cloth tightly, Cryos instantly lost all sense of sight and sound. The High Elf discovered that if he concentrated hard enough, he could feel each step he made as he walked forward with an elven hand upon his shoulder to guide him. After a strange and winding path of over 30,000 paces, after which Cryos had lost count, he felt the strip of cloth being removed. Looking around, he found himself inside a small hut with the same elves that he had encountered in the forest. "These accommodations are very hospitable, Coteen." The Sylvan scout smiled, showing his white teeth behind his dark tan face. "You will stay here until you are called before the High Lady Silver Oak. If you wish to travel the Enclave, you may, so long as it is under guard. If you leave the Enclave for any reason, you will not be permitted to return. If you attempt to return, the Forest Guard will treat your return as an open act of war against us." Cryos nodded. "It is only proper that your Forest Guards would defend their home to the death. But while I stay here, I doubt greatly I will be under the desire to leave such a beauty as of yet." The Sylvan turned and started for the door of the hut just after the rest of his scouts had left. "Remember one thing, High Elf. You may remain in the Enclave for as long as you wish. You may even live out the remainder of your days here in peace. What about my weapons? Those shall be returned to you after they have been inspected. Until then, you may retire if you wish. Simply ask the sentry posted at your door to escort you to any destination inside the Enclave where others would be allowed." The High Elf grinned and nodded to himself as the Sylvan left, closing the door behind him. Cryos picked up his pack and removed his pipe and tobacco kit. Packing the pipe, he reached into his belt pouch and removed a small sliver of wood tipped with a strange substance. The high elf placed the sliver of wood between his first two fingers and put his thumbnail to the edge of the strange substance, scratching it quickly. The tip of the sliver of wood ignited into a tiny burst of flame. Cryos placed the now burning stick into the opening of his pipe, causing tobacco to smolder. In his pipe, Cryos investigated his new residence as he shook out the stick. The small hut allowed only for the common room and two other doors aside from the main door through which the Sylvans had left. The common room sat at the apparent front of the hut, making it easier to entertain guests. Behind the first door, located at the back of the common room to the left, sat a small chamber with a simple copper bucket in one corner and a stand bearing a ewer and basin on the near the door. The other door separated the hut from a simple bedchamber with cabinet for clothing and other objects. Cryos nodded to himself at the elven craft and even the simplest items in the hut. The carved, scrolling images of leaves and other woodland representation made him realize the places he had been had taken him away from even the barest parts of his heritage. Taking a puff from his pipe, Cryos chided himself for even thinking about the regret at having lived with the gnomes for 5 years. Taking a final puff from his pipe, the high elf knocked the ashes into the fireplace and took his pack into the bedchamber, placing it into the cabinet. He had spent many years on the trail, living out of the backpack that had seen better days. He had learned quickly to pack light, travel fast, and sleep with both eyes open. The fact that the Sylvan scouts he'd encountered had placed him in a livable hut didn't sway him either way. He'd made sure he wouldn't lose his traveler's eyes just because 4 walls and a roof over his head. Especially not when certain things, such as his enemy, could take the hut from him once again and return him to the element he'd so long ago escaped.